Welcome, everybody. I'm going to talk about a resource that was put together by myself and a colleague, Matt Jess. It was done under the auspices of Ulster University, but it was funded by CRC. And it was a resource that was attempting to bring the whole decade together, look at each event in turn. So the resource had 5 parts. It looked at the Home Rule crisis. It then looked at World War I, but that included both the war itself and looking at the Rising. The third module, which is the one I'll concentrate on today, was on post-war troubles. But then there were 2 extra modules. One was Mythbusters, which is a sort of fun quiz type thing, which gets people into the period. And the final part, the 5, was a module on commemorations. So I'll say something about what underpins the resource generally before I go on to the post-war troubles section. First of all, it followed CRC's principles for remembering. You'll be aware of those. Start with the facts, look at the implications and consequences, understand that there are different perceptions and interpretations, and that the whole module, the whole resource should be about deepening understanding. We based this resource on a local study of West Belfast, but setting in its wider context of the events of the period. And the idea there was that others in their own area could take the format that we used and put together something similar for their own area. There's a set of guidance that goes with the resource, which includes a lot of the sources and resources and publications and so on that would help people to do that. I want to emphasize that the resource does not tell a narrative. It's evidence-based. It uses source material as much as we can, and it contains a series of activities at every stage. So the idea is that those who are engaging with it will inquire for themselves, weigh up what's put in front of them, and come to their own conclusions about the events. So it's structured around inquiry questions. All through, it tries to compare and contrast the various community reactions at the time to the events that were taking place. But then it also looks at how different communities today might look back on those events, and again, see the commonalities, but also perhaps see some events differently. One thing that we tried to do in the resource right through was to emphasize that viewpoints are never static, that interpretations of history change through time, but even during that decade, there were people whose views moved, and there were certainly people who thought differently to the norms of their own community. Obvious ones are the contribution of Catholics to the First World War. But for instance, we pick up personal stories of the guy who was in the Orange Order and ended up fighting in the Rising and in the War of Independence on the side of Republicans. So little stories like that to demonstrate that we are not all the same, that we do not live in monolithic blocks of thinking, and that attitudes change and there are variations, and that we sit on a continuum. One thing the resource tried to do particularly was to connect past with present. So it's not just about the past. It's about recognizing that the past influences the present, and the way we think today influences the way we interpret the past. And all through, we look at this theme of commemoration, not just what happened, but how have those events been commemorated through time. And then asking the question at the end, I mean, how should we remember these events now? And how should we remember them in the future? I don't want to dwell too long on this, but I think it's worth looking at the commemoration module itself. All through, as I say, we draw attention to how these events are commemorated today. For example, the First World War module starts not with 1914, but starts in 2001 with Alex Maskey commemorating the war at the War Memorial, and then the meeting of President McCully and Queen Elizabeth in 2011. So we start with the commemorations and then look back at the events. This module, commemoration, features the events of 1966. It looks, for instance, at the sorts of decisions that Brian McConnell, the then Minister of Home Affairs, the sorts of decisions he had to make. Does he ban the commemorations? Does he allow them to take place? And there's a whole raft of evidence there which allows people to get into his shoes and make a decision on his behalf. But we also look at the consequences of 1966 and the way it was commemorated. And we do that through two figures, two fairly notorious figures of the more recent Troubles. We look at the influence that it had on Martin Meehan, through his own words, and the influence that it had on Gusty Spence. And then we pose the question again, well, this I suppose was prior to 2016, but that's what happened then. How should we look at these events today? Okay, moving on to the post-war Troubles period. A couple of things here. We were less interested in the political side to this. There is a detailed timeline which people could follow, but the events leading the formation of Northern Ireland are pretty well documented in terms of the politics. What we wanted to capture was what was happening in the streets. So the focus is on the violence of that period, 1920 to 22. And again, we're trying to put a human face on that. Initially, what was it that caused the Troubles in the early 1920s? But all the time that's being mirrored with what happened in 1968 and afterwards for comparison. We look at the violence of the time, and there's so many of the features of that reappeared in the more recent Troubles. The tit-for-tat killings, collusion, these sorts of issues, which are still very hot today, are very much embedded in this module. And the idea is not that people will identify with them one way or the other, but rather that they will recognize that these have been features of our situation for a long time, and that we have to find ways beyond them. Okay, so each of these killings there's a human story behind them, and those stories are told. I mean, there's just two here. A young lad, William Fraser, who was attacked, a young Protestant who was attacked. Another guy comes to his rescue, a Catholic ex-soldier comes to his rescue. He survives, and the soldier is killed. Or another off-duty soldier, Patrick O'Hare, who had come back from the front. There was an attack on his home. He intervened, thinking that wearing his uniform and so on, he would be able to placate the crowd. And instead, he was beaten, returned to army duty. His own family had to leave, and in later times, he joined the Republican movement. Okay, we do a case study, which is fairly hot, and it's looking at the Nixon gang. The murders which took place in the 1921 period, which have been attributed to a rogue gang within the Royal Irish Constabulary. But again, we do not tell that as a narrative. There is a whole pack of evidence, and we would envisage this being done by small groups of people sitting around a table. The evidence is on the table, and they're asked to come to a conclusion. Truth or myth? How far was there collusion? How far was Nixon implicated in these events? So each of the murders that has been associated with the gang are documented. The evidence is provided. This is a victim, Alec McBride. And obviously I won't go into all the details in the short time we have available. Or the even more infamous killing of the Mahan family and the attack that took place. But all the evidence gathered here is a summary of eyewitness accounts at the time. But there's also evidence there that was gathered by the Southern government. The Southern government didn't trust the Northern government's investigation, and instead they had their own people on the ground gathering intelligence. So this is just an example of that, where in their files they have named the RIC officers that they attribute to being involved in the gang. Some more information on the victims themselves. And you'll see from that list that many of them were involved in the Republican movement, but others were not. And some more eyewitness accounts on the right. So, okay, people have got this pack in front of them and they've got to make sense of it. Right through the pack, there is guidance as to how that inquiry can be followed. This involves a dog that was found at the scene of one of the murders, and the police carried it away and the dog was never seen again, but it was always claimed that the dog itself belonged to one of the RIC officers, a guy called Christy Clark. And again, questions there about how important is it to remember these events, or should we forget them? And at the end, why are we still arguing about events 100 years later? So much of Ireland's history is controversial. Do we move on? How do we remember these? How do we turn these events into positive examples that we can move forward by remembering them in an appropriate way? And just to demonstrate that these events are live, these are quotes from a debate in the Assembly from the 24th of May 2010, where a number of politicians from different sides of the fence draw attention to the B specials and their impact and their legacy. So again, linking past and present whenever we can to get people to think about those connections and how we use history today. Conscious that time's nearly up, so just to draw your attention to the Mythbusters, there's about 25 little myths from the whole period from 1912 to 22 that are featured. For instance, signing of the covenant in blood. The evidence is that there's only one real claim, and that was Fred Crawford, the gun runner, But that has been scientifically examined, and it's unlikely that it was in his own blood. It was probable that he signed it in red as a symbolic gesture, although he later claimed himself that it was his own blood. So we take things like that. We look at death rates at home and abroad, the number of people killed in the Rising as against the number of people killed in the same week from the nationalist community at the front, and compare.